Good afternoon. Thank you so much for being with us today. I'm Janice Kaminer-Resnick, and on behalf of the leadership team at America at a Crossroads, I welcome you. Our leadership team includes myself, former Congressman Mel Levine, and former County Supervisor Zev Yaroslavsky. That's Los Angeles County Supervisor. Thank you and welcome back to tonight's wonderful guest, Ron Brownstein, and to our amazing moderator, Larry Mantle. We're all looking forward to tonight's conversation, which will focus on various aspects of the political scene of the day. What can I say? Of the moment, of the day, of the year. Looking ahead next week, this is perfect visionary timing. Sometimes it really works for the next 2 weeks. On August 20th, we'll have Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman, who will join Madeline Brandman to discuss how the West deceived itself about Russia and betrayed Ukraine. Given the meetings this week going on between Trump and Putin, there will be plenty to talk about. And the following week, we have retired U.S. Navy Admiral and former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mike Mullen, in conversation with Warren Onley on war, peace, and the American future. Insights from the former Joint Chiefs of Staff. So the next 2 weeks, we have a lot of international insights that we will be gaining from two really important voices. We're also, just to remind you, this week sometime you'll get the dates, two important add-on programs. In October, we're going to do a deep dive on the masked men of ICE and the raids that began in LA that are now spreading across the country. That'll be October 9th. You'll get information about it. And September, right before Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, we're going to be doing a roundtable with a small group of rabbis from across the United States on the subject of what should rabbis and Jews be talking and thinking about as we enter into the new year during these fraught times. Now, without further ado, please welcome tonight's outstanding moderator, Larry Mantle. Larry is a veteran NPR radio talk show host with what I think is the longest running talk radio show anywhere. It's called Air Talk. It's amazing. It's part of those of us who are lucky enough to live in earshot, which is Southern California. We are very grateful to Larry for his amazing daily show. We are very appreciative to have Larry as a member of our America at a Crossroads team. Larry, the program is yours.
Thank you so much, Janice. I appreciate it. And Mel and Zev, it's wonderful to be back. And last night I was doing an event at the Skirball Center in Los Angeles, and I had so many of our viewers come up and share their appreciation for these remarkable America at a Crossroads programs that Janice and the team put together. Is just, she mentioned the timeliness of it. Over the next couple weeks, that's the norm for America at a Crossroads. It's astonishing to me how frequently the guests that Janice books on the program are just essentially ripped from the headlines and match with the day's events. And I'm honored to be a part of the program. It's a pleasure. And thanks to all of you who've been so loyal to these programs for the many years, 5 years now that they've been offered. Thank you so much for being an important part of this viewing community as well. It's particularly a pleasure for me to talk with Ron Brownstein. We've covered a range of topics in the past, including the last presidential race. This evening, we'll focus on the latest political developments of a highly tumultuous 2025. One of the things I appreciate is Ron's expertise. His breadth of knowledge is so wide that your questions are going to play a very key role in this conversation, because there's a great deal we can talk about. We're both interested in knowing what you would like to have Ron discuss. So please don't be hesitant. Please share your questions with us in the Q&A at the bottom of the page. If you wouldn't mind including your location along with your first name, that's great, because I can just read from where you're asking the question. Again, that's in the Q&A at the bottom of the page. Many of you know Ron because he's a frequent guest on America at a Crossroads, but he continues as CNN senior political analyst, where he's been for many years. He first came to my attention some 30 years ago when he was national correspondent for the Los Angeles Times. He joined CNN soon afterward. Ron's currently a columnist for Bloomberg Opinion, a frequent guest with us on these programs, and a two-time finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. Ron, it's great to talk with you again.
Hey, Larry, nice to be with you again. Thanks for having me.
So I want to start with the leadership of Judge issued a statement condemning the Trump administration's $1 billion demand of UCLA. Also, more than $500 million in research grants have been frozen by the feds. Yesterday's federal court decision appears to restore part of the funds, pending a potential higher court decision. From a political standpoint, what is the upside for the president in these high-profile battles with UCLA, Harvard, Columbia, and other elite schools?
Well, first of all, you have to see these fights they are one strand in a broader weave, right? I mean, what Trump is doing with universities is part and parcel of what he is doing with media institutions, with business leaders, with law firms, where he is essentially trying to erode the capacity of any independent institution in society to resist him and his agenda. I mean, it is very similar to what we have seen in other countries that have experienced democratic backsliding, whether it's Hungary or Turkey. Whatever the merits of the complaints about the way schools like Columbia and Harvard and UCLA and others handle protests about Gaza and handled, obvious incidences of anti-Semitism on campus, it's really hard to believe that is fundamentally what is driving Trump here. I mean, I think he is using that as a lever to try to assert more ideological control over universities. I mean, these settlements, he is seeking extraordinary federal intervention into kind of the day-to-day life of these campuses in terms of who they admit, who they hire, how and what they teach, similar to what we are seeing to what he is doing with businesses. I mean, the agreement with NVIDIA to basically give the U.S. a share in exports to China, or his golden share of U.S. steel. For a party that has marketed itself, at least since Reagan, as the small government party that is designed to get government out of your life, you are seeing, I think, a consistent effort across the board to expand government control over other institutions in society and civil society and the business and local government in a way we'll talk about a little later, that has more in common with what we've seen in places that have experienced democratic backsliding than with anything in the American tradition.
Ron, before we move on from higher education, there are those who say that, these elite schools really brought this on themselves by not denouncing anti-Semitism, by catering to social justice fundamentalists. And do they have a point that these schools really got serious after Trump came after them? I know there was the lawsuit with UCLA or against UCLA that they settled with the students who alleged anti-Semitic behavior from which they were not protected. But is there something to be said that the sledgehammer that Trump is using is seeing results with these schools taking on policies that further protect Jewish students and that might lead to more political diversity on campus, more ideological diversity?
I guess the question is, what is the this they have brought on themselves? I mean, what Trump is pursuing with elite institutions goes way beyond any question of what they did or did not do during the Gaza protests. I mean, it's looking for a much broader range of interventions and grip for the federal government that is, I think, fundamentally much more about advancing an ideological agenda than it is about protecting Jewish students. I actually think Jewish groups, and who knows how this will go in the questions, I think Jewish groups have been woefully mistaken in seeming to welcome this at times or not condemn this at times, because there is no version of state-sanctioned suppression of speech or punishment of alternative views in which Jews come out a winner in the long run. I mean, I think the ADL has been bizarre during this, seeming to welcome individual actions that Trump has taken without kind of looking at the big picture. It goes to something that is much larger that I think we're going to talk about, which is the way in which elite institutions in every aspect of American life are basically betting they can make their own deal as Trump erodes the kind of basic constructs of democracy. They can make a good deal for themselves rather than joining together to resist the whole enterprise. And I think the history of all of these countries, whether it's Hungary or Putin's Russia or Turkey, is that you can't make a deal for yourself against a kind of an authoritarian, encroaching authoritarianism. I call it the Lando Calrissian principle. Larry, do you remember in the second Star Wars movie, The Empire Strikes Back, the Billy D. Williams character says at one point in his dealings with Darth Vader, this deal just keeps getting worse. And I think that's what people are discovering and need to kind of understand. And anyone who thinks they can advance their own interests by supporting this kind of encroaching on civil liberties and civil rights, I think in the long run is mistaken and is doing great damage to the civil rights and civil liberties of all of us. And I don't think Jewish groups that have welcomed some of the steps Trump has taken or welcomed the seizing of individuals have really thought this through.
Do you think what they're looking to do, though, these institutions, whether they're law firms, whether they're
Mhm.
universities, are looking to buy time? Their hope is they'll cut some sort of a deal now. Trump will lose interest. He'll move on to the next shiny thing. And essentially, they'll claw their way back somewhat closer to where they were. Do you think this is really strategic, more than fear-driven, or the simple dollar amounts that are on the table here so vast, they're terrified of losing those funds and willing to do anything to keep them?
Well, I mean, maybe implicit in your questions, I think it's both. I think they are obviously fear of, the very, what was the very first law firm? Was it Skadden Arps where they sent the memo saying, even if we win, we'll be destroyed because our clients won't want to hire us. And in fact, said that other law firms were trying to poach their clients by saying, you can't, if they now have the scarlet letter on them. But that I think is ultimately wrong. It's a misguided calculation. I think the most important thing that has been written, we can talk about this later, but it applies now. I think the most important thing that's been written in the Trump 2 was the op-ed in late July by, let me get the guy's name, David Pressman, was the US ambassador to Hungary under Biden. And he wrote an op-ed in the New York Times basically, I am watching here what I watch there, which is that all of these individuals, all of these individual institutions, all of these individual rich guys are betting they can make their own deal. And as you say, buy time, come out ahead, and maybe even benefit. And that's what we saw there. But in the process, they are emboldening the accretion of power that Trump is pursuing in the executive branch and the erosion of democratic safeguards, and that it didn't work there and it won't work here. You can't buy off someone with autocratic tendencies because in the Lando Calrissian principle, they can always come back and demand more, and likely will come back and demand more.
Ron, I want to talk about the immigration enforcement tactics that we've seen largely in Southern California, but in other areas of the
Yeah.
country as well. And it's very clear from the polling that's happened since the election of President Trump that the public is in large part disturbed by what they're seeing. People want the enforcement of immigration laws, prioritizing people with criminal records beyond the fact that they've come into the country illegally. And I just wonder, ultimately, does this end up washing back on Trump so badly that for immigration hawks who want to see greater enforcement in the long run, this is going to hurt their cause? Of course, they're disrupting thousands of people's lives in the process, but I wonder if in the long run, this hurts their cause.
Well, first, I would say I've been writing about immigration since Prop 187 in California in 94, and writing specifically about public opinion on immigration for over 30 years now. And public opinion on immigration, the political scientists would famously say is thermostatic. It moves in the opposite direction of the incumbent administration. When you have a Democratic administration, the public generally moves toward more hawkish positions. And then when you have a Republican administration, they kind of pull back from that. Having said that, there is a through line. I mean, I've written about polls about immigration for 30 years, and the American public have believed several things at once. They do not consider them contradictory or incompatible. They believe we should be a nation of laws, we should have a border, people should respect the process, and that it is unrealistic to deport 11 million people, many of whom have U.S. citizen children and have long roots in our communities. And you are seeing, I think, that enduring through line of public opinion imprint itself on the reaction to what Trump is doing because he gets very good marks from a majority of the public will say they approve of what he is doing at the border, that he has got the border under control to a far greater extent than it appeared under Biden. Now, part of that is walking back from our international commitments to provide opportunities for asylum, but leaving that aside, the public viewed what was happening as the border as unacceptably chaotic under Biden. It did hurt Harris and Biden in 24, and they give Trump solid marks for what he is doing there, whether they should or not. They are differentiating between the border and interior enforcement, right? And on interior enforcement, as you suggest, he is facing much bigger backlash, particularly over what was, given, as I said, that one of the through lines of public opinion is that Americans think that people who have been here for a long time, have no criminal record, may have U.S. citizen kids or spouses, deserve an opportunity to stay here. That is what the public is recoiling against. And, it is, and you are seeing, I think, some of the possible 28 Democrats themselves making this distinction between the border and what Trump is doing on the interior. Ruben Gallego in Iowa the other day, Gavin Newsom, and multiple appearances, including this remarkable 4-hour podcast he did with a conservative podcast host, which I listened to the whole thing. Maybe we'll talk about later about him. But I do think the thermostatic effect is kicking in. Now, for Trump, I think, again, going back to my point before, the aggressive immigration enforcement is partially about fulfilling his campaign promise and the ethnic cleansing aspect of what he is doing and how it appeals to portions of his base. But it is also about finding a rationale to deploy federal force into blue cities. Like immigration is the hook on which the first hook, and not the last, as we're seeing in DC, on which they justified sending federal military assets into blue cities. I mean, I think it is very clear they are trying to numb Americans to the sight of armored Humvees on the streets of U.S. cities, particularly U.S. cities in blue states. And immigration provides a ground on which they feel politically secure to begin that. But as we're seeing in DC, they are now extending it to crime and homelessness. And he said during the campaign that he wanted to extend it to crime and homelessness. So I think you're going to see militarized immigration enforcement in other cities as a way not only of pursuing his mass deportation goals, but of kind of widening this beachhead around the
I guess
idea.
my point is though, Ron, that I think it's counterproductive to his cause. That I understand what you're saying, that all these ICE operations, because they instill fear, and it's palpable front of mind for so many people in Southern California who are affected by this. But that the backlash it's created in other parts of the country, because the other, similar to the thermostatic response you're talking about, is the issue that when it's personal, people's perspectives change. They have a theoretical idea that illegal immigration is bad. There are all these people getting benefits. We're in the United States and we shouldn't be paying. But that's all sort of, the writ large theoretical. When they see families that are ripped apart, when they see, people on their way to school, families are stopped, things like that, I think it creates a very different reaction when you see what those policies mean in practice. So I wonder if this undermines that federalizing of cities.
I think that's a very reasonable interpretation, Larry, of what we are seeing in public opinion. I mean, for many voters, this is more than they signed up for. Now, it took a willful suspension of disbelief to convince yourself that Trump was really talking only about criminals. He said he would prioritize criminals. He also said people should not be surprised this is what he is doing, even if they are. Nonetheless, something like 30% of the Latino voters who voted for him said they oppose mass deportation. And people managed because they wanted to vote for Trump for other reasons, primarily because they felt the cost of living was unaffordable. They wanted to convince themselves, they wanted to hear that he was only going to be targeting criminals. And now what they are watching is something very different than that. So, yeah, I do think there is a reaction among a meaningful number of voters that this was more than I signed up for. And I think there is a backlash against it. And I guess we will see whether that is sufficient to prevent him from doing what we saw in LA somewhere else. I don't know the
Ron,
answer. If I had to bet, I think the answer is going to be no, because he's always been someone who worries more about his base than anyone else. But I think you're right that there is a backlash. I'm just less convinced it's going to convince him to change course.
let's talk about what the declining approval rating of President Trump means for Democrats, because there's been so much ink spilled,
Yeah.
figuratively, over Democrats not having their act together, not really understanding how to prioritize what they're going to fight with Trump's actions. So, what do you see as the state of the party right now, just generally, and then we'll get into some specifics.
Yeah. People probably do not have no reason to remember this unless they do this for a living like I do. But in the fall of 2010, on the eve of an election in which Republicans won more House seats than any party had won since 1938, over 60 House seats, right? Democrats lost over 60 seats, got wiped out in the Senate. In the fall of 2010, the Democratic image in Gallup, positive, negative, was more favorable than the Republican image. And yet Democrats got annihilated. Same thing, by the way, in 2014. And they got annihilated. And they got annihilated because midterm elections are fundamentally about the incumbent president. They are fundamentally an opportunity for voters to cast their verdict on the first 2 years of a president. And so I actually think that now, I'll qualify what I'm about to say, but I actually think that the concern about the Democratic image is not really justified for 26. I don't think it's going to be nearly as big a factor in the 26 midterm election as voters' assessment of Trump's first 2 years. I think that is what midterm elections are now about more than anything else. The single most important number in a midterm election is the president's approval rating. And Trump's approval rating was 45% in the exit poll on election day in 2018. And they lost over 40 House seats. Now, where I qualify that is that the party image probably does matter in some statewide races, particularly in red-leaning states where Trump may now be underwater, but voters are deeply suspicious of Democratic candidates. But having said that, even in the Senate races in 2018, Trump's approval was a very good predictor. Where he was over 50, Republicans won in Indiana, Missouri, Florida, and North Dakota. And where he was under 50 in Colorado and Nevada, they lost. The exceptions were those three Democratic incumbents who held on in 50-plus Trump states in Ohio: Sherrod Brown, Montana, Tester, and Manchin in West Virginia. Ultimately, they lost all of those seats. The Democratic image problem is real, and the party, I think, it is going to be a factor in 2028. But I think it can really only be resolved by a presidential candidate. I don't know if there's a way for, quote, Democrats to change the way voters are seeing them while Trump is in the White House. The Democratic image I've written is probably in its worst shape since the end of the Reagan years. And it was really, circling the drain after Bush beat Dukakis in '88. But Bill Clinton won in '92 by redefining the party. And that is going to be necessary for the Democrats in 28. But it is something that a presidential candidate can do. And I think only a presidential candidate can do. So, yeah, I mean, for 26, I mean, Democrats have to keep the focus on Trump. And what Democrats are for is probably less important. The contract with America is not why Republicans won 50 seats in 94. It was because similar to 2010, voters were rejecting the first 2 years of a Democratic president. The question, of course, will be, as we talked about a little in the pregame, what aspect of Trump should be front and center
Yeah, and I want to get into that
yeah,
because you have Gavin Newsom, of course, California's governor, who is just responsive to Trump and essentially tries to counter the moves, whether it's going to be Texas
yeah.
redistricting in the middle of the decade, and what we'll take to voters an initiative, or legislatively placed proposition, which is going to ask California voters to overturn the independent redistricting commission. It's sort of counterpunch is the
Mhm.
Gavin Newsom approach to it. But does that make sense to you from a political standpoint, or is there another approach you think would be more effective?
So interestingly, on the day that Trump sent the National Guard into DC, Nancy Pelosi tweeted, "This is a distraction from his failure to lower prices and his bill that cut Medicaid from while funding tax cuts for the rich." Right? She said it's a distraction. Newsom tweeted on the same day that this is an ominous step toward authoritarianism. Right? Very different. And I think that encapsulates the fundamental debate among Democrats, which is important for people to understand, not unique to Democrats. The experts that I talk to, the people who study Democratic backsliding, have written about it, Ziblatt and Levitsky, Brendan Nyhan at Dartmouth, Susan Stokes at the Democracy Lab at the University of Chicago. They will tell you that around the world, parties that are running against quasi-authoritarian or really fully authoritarian strongman opponents, whether it's Hungary, Turkey, Poland, Venezuela, wherever, they go through the same debate. Do you run on the authoritarianism itself, or do you run on the price of eggs? Right? Do you treat the strongman leader as a unique threat, or do you try to beat him through the normal arguments of politics that focus on the day-to-day material concern of voters? There is not Larry, there's not a clear consensus in the political science literature which is better, but there is a clear tilt in what ultimately wins out, which is that in most cases, the parties contesting with strongman opponents do run more on the price of eggs than on democracy.
Well, and we saw, Democrats have been running for a long time about Trump being a threat for democracy. When Georgia redid its
Yeah,
election laws, it was, this is Jim Crow again,
yeah,
and a lot of that kind of rhetoric that Democrats, and then it ended up more African American voters in Georgia than they'd ever had. But
yeah.
but but there's
So,
this sort of very heated rhetoric that
yeah.
Democrats have used, and it doesn't seem to have worked.
Well, okay. So as I said, this is not a unique problem. People here watching should not view this as something as a unique failing of Democrats. This is a question that, fair-minded people around the world have wrestled with. I think there is no question, as the Pelosi tweet signifies, that among the congressional leadership of Democrats, whether it's Chuck Schumer or Hakeem Jeffries, they want to run on the price of eggs. They want to run on the argument that Trump promised to make your cost of living more affordable, and he hasn't. And if anything, he has made it worse by imposing these tariffs, and especially by withdrawing federal support, cutting Medicaid to fund tax cuts for the rich. That's how Bill Clinton turned around his presidency after that 94 landslide that we talked about. He was in the dumps for all of 95. Nothing he did worked. But when Newt Gingrich passed a budget in the fall of 95 that simultaneously cut taxes and cut programs, Clinton basically was able to revive his presidency and put himself on a glide path toward reelection. Anybody on the audience old enough to remember the phrase M2E2? Larry, you're old enough. Do you remember M2E2?
No.
Medicare, Medicaid, education, and the environment. He basically said, I will protect M2E2, and Republicans are endangering it to cut taxes for rich people. This bill, this one big beautiful bill, is the first time since that 95 legislation that Republicans have cut taxes and cut spending in the same bill. The '01 and '03 Bush tax cuts and the '17 Trump tax cuts were all sugar, no spinach. It was only tax cuts. They kept the spending cuts far away from it. In fact, they didn't really pursue any spending cuts under those presidents. But because the House conservatives demanded it, they put them together in this bill. And so, the CBO, the Yale Budget Lab, the Penn Wharton budget model have all put out analyses that shows that for most people at 70,000 or below, they are net losers from this bill. They lose more in the cuts and the added debt than they get from the tax cuts. That is what Hakeem Jeffries and Chuck Schumer want to run on. I mean, Chuck Schumer is out in New York this week doing what is he? I think he calls it his micro. He's like in Binghamton and Troy and Utica talking about how the Trump agenda cost those communities specifically. That's what they want to do. Now, the problem with that is that this other stuff, the House is on fire. If you care about democratic norms, the House and democratic accountability, and you wonder whether Democrats are trying to run a traditional election in something that may not look like a traditional election by 26 or certainly by 28, I think there are a lot of Democrats who find that inadequate. And so you have Newsom, Pritzker, Chris Murphy, who are not framing this as a distraction. They are framing this as a legitimate concern in its own right. And I actually think it is a mistake to describe this as a distraction, because I believe that as important as tax cuts and killing climate regulations are, they are not the primary goal of what Trump and the people around him are waking up every day.
But Ron, do you think Americans really think that sending the National Guard to Washington, D.C., that is part of the strategy for the federal government taking over democratic cities? Do you think most Americans believe that?
I think that Schumer and Jeffries are right. That if your goal is to get to 218 House seats and 51 Senate seats, that the way you can maximize your chances of doing that is to focus on Trump's inability to make people's cost of living more affordable and the fundamental values trade-off of cutting programs for the working class to fund tax cuts for the rich. I think they are right that that has the broadest political impact. I think it is wrong to assume and to discuss the movement toward authoritarianism, both because the failure of institutions to resist it is a serious problem. And anything that can be done to kind of stiffen the spine of the institutions conceding to Trump is important. But also, just in a political sense, I do think that argument does resonate with white collar places where Democrats that are now absolutely essential to democratic chances. I mean, I think people do get it. I think people who are living paycheck to paycheck probably don't have the luxury of worrying about whether Trump is eroding democratic norms. I think many of them clearly don't. But I think it is a reason why white collar, white voters who might lean Republican on economic issues can be moved to vote against Trump on these grounds too. So I don't think it's an either or, and I think it's a mistake to call it a distraction, because it's not a distraction. It's the main event.
Let's talk about the House, what Trump has been pressuring Republicans in Texas to do. The Democratic state legislators, take off and go to Illinois and elsewhere. So if this ends up being an all-out gerrymandering war, some of the analysis that I've read indicates Democrats actually have more to lose from that than Republicans do. Do you concur with that assessment?
Yes, absolutely. So I wrote about that today. So, the current, if every state can be convinced to squeeze out every possible seat, there are probably, in the end, a half a dozen more, 4 or 5, 6 more Republican seats that Republicans can gain than Democrats can gain. I mean, Democrats can gain 5 in California. And if I had to bet, if Texas goes ahead and California puts this on the ballot, voters will approve it. I'm interested in your opinion. And they might be able to neutralize 5 and 5. But then you've got Florida, you got Ohio, you got Missouri. Indiana, they seem to be balking, interestingly. And where do Democrats go next? I mean, they might be able to get a little more out of Illinois, maybe the last Republican seat in Maryland. New York, because of the way their constitution works, they probably can't do this till 28, although someone told me yesterday they're trying to find a way to do some more in 26. The answer is that yes, Republicans can squeeze out more seats than Democrats. Um, Probably not enough to make a difference if there is a substantial, wave. Certainly not enough to make a difference if there's a substantial wave. But, we are now, Larry, in the past three sessions, right? Past three Congresses, the majority for the majority party has been 10 seats or less. That's never happened in American history. We've never had three Congresses in a row with a majority of 10 seats or less. And the reason it's so small now is because the outliers have basically been purged. I mean, in that 94 and 2010 elections that we talked about, the Democratic blue dogs in rural blue collar areas were hunted virtually to extinction. And then in that 28 midterm that I mentioned, the white collar Republicans surviving in suburban districts were not hunted to extinction, but were severely diminished. They're on the Endangered Species Act. They've applied, they've qualified for the Endangered Species Act. So there's not that much mismatched terrain side in narrow. So, I don't know if Democrats can win 40 seats, even if Trump's approval rating is 42 in the fall of 26. But,
Well,
they can win
and
15.
I mean the downside of this too, I think for the democracy is it means that people who are members of the minority party in whatever state they live in are
Yeah,
essentially going to be unrepresented. So if we
completely
care about
disenfranchised.
democracy and people being represented, and almost no Republicans in California are represented, or Democrats are largely shut out in
You
Texas, this
know,
is a big deal.
it is. I wrote about this today, Larry, in my Bloomberg column, and inadvertently, it's really inadvertently, the 2020 maps, post 2020 maps, ended up producing district lines that all of the experts who study this, Sam Wang at Princeton, Nicholas Stephanopoulos at the Harvard Election Law Clinic, they will tell you the maps right now are pretty neutral. Unlike post 1980 and 1990, where Democrats were able to gerrymander because they still control all the South at that point, or post 2010, where Republicans are really gerrymandered. 2020, both sides kind of tilted the maps in their favor where they could, but it largely netted out and it evened out. And so the expectation is that whichever side wins the most popular votes in the House is probably going to have the majority before we started this. The flaw in the current maps was that there's virtually no competition. Like both sides have created a lot more safe seats, especially Republicans. The Republican states, only 8 of 184 seats drawn by Republican control map makers in 24 were decided by 5 points or less. Only 8 of 184. And it's only 37 nationwide. And if we go down this road, the likelihood is that not only will you see less representation for the minority party in all of these states, you'll also see less competition. This is really a moment to pull back from the brink. I mean, you can go through this incredibly arduous and polarizing and contested process and maybe end up with 5 more Republican seats than when you started. I mean, we would be better off if both sides said, okay, let's walk back. Let's set some national standards. Let's ban mid-decade redistricting. By the way, did you see JD Vance on Fox last Sunday? He said, we want to redo the 2020 census. He did not say whether they want to redo the 2020 census before 2030, but he certainly left open that possibility, as has Trump.
Well,
And they may seek to try to not only redistrict, but reapportion before 2030 to shift electoral college and votes and House seats out of California, New York, Illinois, Pennsylvania, and into Texas, Florida, Utah, and Arizona. So that is something else to keep an eye on. I
Oh,
mean,
and wasn't it the president himself who said, if I'm not mistaken, that undocumented residents should not be counted in
yeah.
the census? Well, and of course, for states like California with large numbers of undocumented residents, that would have a huge impact. But I thought there were court decisions that pretty clearly laid out that undocumented residents had a right to be represented in the census and politically, even though they can't vote.
Well, first of all, the 14th Amendment specifically said apportionment should be based on the whole number of persons in each state. So, we have a Supreme Court that's been very creative, but that is a lot to get around to exclude undocumented immigrants. By the way, I talked to a guy this week, a University of Minnesota sociologist, who, with a colleague from the Migration Policy Institute, ran the numbers before Trump even won on what would have happened if you excluded the undocumented from the 2020 census. What would have happened to apportionment? And their conclusion was a wash. Texas,
Oh.
Texas would lose a seat. Ohio would lose a seat. Texas and California would each lose a seat, and Ohio and New York would each gain a seat. Where the impact could be greater is in what we're watching now within states, where the essence of the redistricting that's happening in Texas and is on tap in Florida and other states is to diminish representation in the big metro areas that are actually driving all of the population growth in these states, and to crack the metro areas into these pie-shaped districts where the metros are overwhelmed by white rural Republicans. So if you exclude undocumented from the population count of a state, it gets easier to minimize the clout of the metro centers in that state and to shift power, and for that matter, federal funding toward the rural areas. And I think, people I talked to this week said, yeah, you can bet we're going to be in court. And you can bet that, Rob Bonta is probably going to have to be in court before 2028 and maybe even 2026 when Trump's Commerce Secretary announces that they are excluding the undocumented from the
It's
count.
California Attorney
Yeah,
General.
general.
Ron, a little bit later, I want to ask you about the Los Angeles Olympic Games because you, as an
Mm,
Angelino, and me being here,
mm.
it's very front of mind with President's announcement last week, I think it was, of this national committee that's going to be looking at the Olympic Games. But I do want to get to our viewer questions,
Sure, you bet.
and let me start. I have a number of viewers who have asked about the national debt and whether there's actually a strategy here in running up the debt, whether there's some advantage in raising the national debt.
Well, historically there has been the starve the beast argument from Grover Norquist and other traditional small government anti-tax Republicans that if the debt gets bigger, it gets easier to push for spending cuts. It creates a political environment in which spending cuts are more tolerable to the public. I don't see Trump pursuing that. I don't see that as a motivation for Trump. I don't think Trump really, I don't know, as I said before, I don't think spending cuts are really a big, it's kind of striking to me that he let Musk go as far as he did, and that he signed on to what was a kind of pre-Trumpian Paul Ryan era Republican agenda of cutting Medicaid so substantially, because I think his fundamental mission is shattering the ability of Blue America to resist him and the MAGA movement and imposing the kind of the red state agenda on Blue America. And in that way, the spending cuts are actually a risk like that he doesn't need in that. So I don't. That is certainly what many conservative Republicans have argued in the past. I don't see it as a motivation for Trump. I think Trump wanted to cut taxes. He's wanted to cut the federal government because he views it as another source of resistance to his kind of broader project of transforming the society. But I think that he accepted the spending cuts rather than pursued them as a way of mollifying the right in his own coalition.
Anna says, I fear there'll be fallout from Trump's punishment for anti-Semitism at UCLA and other targeted campuses, and that this is going to increase hatred of Jews. Anna says, a friend wrote, look at what the Jews did to our universities. They think they deserve special treatment. And Anna wonders if this is ultimately going to harm Jewish life on campuses, and whether there's even this is strategic on Trump's part to do just that.
I don't know if it's strategic on Trump's part, but I had not thought of that, but I agree. I mean, I think that this is one of, I think the Jewish groups that are supporting what Trump is doing on campuses are making a giant mistake. I just think that, in the same way that, Jeff Bezos or, Zuckerberg or anyone else, or Tim Cook, the most servile one, in the same way that they're thinking they can cut their own deal, just remember Lando. I don't think you can cut your own deal. I think you lose in the end. And I think this is another reason. I mean, associating in any way with this kind of illiberalism, even if it is being applied toward an end that you may tactically support, I think ultimately will come around to bite you.
Robin asks, has the DNC completed an autopsy since the 2024 election? And if it has, why hasn't a report or a summary of its conclusions been released? And if it hasn't been completed, are some people slow walking it to cover for themselves or others?
So, my good friend and former, used to work for me, Shane Goldmacher at the New York Times, wrote a terrific piece in the New York Times, kind of reporting on the progress of this, and basically reporting that the DNC had indicated it was basically going to look at tactical questions and not kind of the big overarching issues. I think the 24 election was lost. And I'm going to say, I don't think that's unreasonable. I don't think we need a DNC assessment of like why they lost, because if you ask me, they lost it in the way they governed, not in the way they ran. Like Biden, this election was lost in 21 and 22 when the border got out of control and prices got out of control. And the 22 election sent a misleading signal that it was possible to surmount the discontent over Biden's record, because voters at that point were so focused on abortion and, in many cases, the extremism of the Trump alternatives that Democrats did surprisingly well in the election. It numbed, in the midterm, it numbed Democrats to how deep the hole actually was. And when we got back to 2024, we saw voters vote the way they usually do in presidential races, which is that when they're unhappy with the party in power, they vote for the party out of power. I don't know if I need a DNC commission to
All right.
address that. I mean,
Ron,
yeah, go ahead.
we have so many
Yeah,
questions.
sure.
A number of viewers have asked, what do you think is going to come of the Epstein controversy?
Under this Trump Justice Department, I don't think anything's going to come of it that is significantly going to hurt him. I mean, I just can't imagine a world in which something that is really dangerous to Trump gets out on, past Pam Bondi, unless somebody somehow leaks it. And I've got to think that if that stuff was there, we would have seen, while the Democrats were controlling the administration, somehow it would have surfaced. I mean, if there's a memo from Epstein to Trump about, whatever, I I just have a hard time believing this is going to be I think it's going to be a nagging problem for him. I don't think it's going to develop into more than that.
Robert in Pennsylvania asks whether California Democrats understand that the rest of the country does not want another California Democratic presidential nominee. Robert says the surest way for Democrats to lose is to nominate Gavin Newsom. And after two failed presidential campaigns, Robert asked, does Kamala Harris understand Democrats around the rest of the country desperately do not want her to run again?
So interestingly, I think that the formula that Newsom is pursuing makes a lot of sense for the eventual Democratic nominee, and it remains to be seen precisely for this reason whether he is the one who can benefit from it. Newsom, a la Clinton in 92, to a degree that people are not fully recognizing, is moving to neutralize and to reposition on issues that have hurt the Democrats in recent years, whether it's homelessness, transgender, access for immigrants to undocumented immigrants to the state Medicaid program and so forth. And he is, at the same time he is doing that, he is, as we said, moved to the forefront of fighting Trump. And I think he is making the correct bet that in a Democratic primary, being seen as resisting Trump is going to be more important than meeting a lot of ideological purity tests. So you can kind of, the way I look at it, he is walking a very smart tightrope where you can get yourself theoretically through a primary by being tough on Trump without hurting your potential chances in a general election by moving left during the primary. The problem is that the voters who might be most receptive to this kind of positioning, many of them, like Robert, are going to have questions about nominating a governor in California. So Newsom is making progress. I mean, he has caught the attention of Democrats nationwide because I think he is seen as more effectively than any other single Democrat as pushing back on Trump. But whether he is the one who can ultimately benefit from that, I think will depend on how many people agree with our questioner.
Many viewers have asked, how can Democrats better reach what are often referred to as low information voters? Democrats, I think, have largely in the past thought those are our voters.
Yeah.
These are we get them to come in and vote in presidential elections. They accrue to our advantage.
Totally
And
right.
in the last election, that didn't. So what can be done to woo them back?
So first of all, and the reverse of that is going to be true in 26, which is Democrats now do better among high participation voters, which tend to be college educated. The midterm election is usually 2 to 3 points more college plus than the presidential year, and that should benefit Democrats in the midterm. Okay, this is one of my theories. I don't think I can fully prove this yet, but I think the answer to that is what I was talking about before. It's more governing than messaging. When we were in most of the 21st century, the dominant view in both parties, started by Karl Rove, Matt Dowd, and Mark McKinnon, thoroughly, completely adopted by David Plouffe and David Axelrod under Obama, and then again by Trump in 2016, was that there are no swing voters left, that everybody is really a partisan of one side or the other, and they just don't want to wear the jersey. Like 6% of voters are really movable in any given election. So all you got to do is focus on turning out your base. We're now in a world where 160 million people are voting in the Trump era. And I believe that has resurfaced the swing voter. I think the last 15 million or so are people who are not that heavily invested in the arguments or messaging between the parties, but are really voting on how they think things are going in the country and their own lives. And I think Democrats obviously have to kind of reach into the places where those voters are, YouTube and podcasts and all that. But above all, I think those voters in 28 are going to be voting on whether they think Trump solved their problems or not, and whether they think the Democratic nominee can solve their problems or not. And I think what we're watching from Newsom is a kind of, and others, he's not the only one, Ruben Gallego, very, very similar, is kind of like saying, okay, let's try to downplay some of these polarizing hot button cultural issues, not because whether or not voters will agree with us on it, because we want these low information voters to be seeing us as prioritizing their economic well-being, not who can play on which sports team in high school. So it's governing more than messaging. Messaging is important, but governing matters more. And the ball is in Trump's court, I think, on this. And if he fails, there will be a real opening for Democrats there.
Susan says there are several important elections this year, including
Yeah.
gubernatorial races, Virginia, New Jersey, obviously the New York City mayoral elections getting a great deal of attention, special elections for open house and seats. Just a couple of races particularly that you think are important and worth watching as bellwethers.
Yeah, I think Vice President Spanberger. I think the Virginia governor's race and the New Jersey governor's race are the two biggest. And Virginia is probably not a fair test case of where we are because the Republican candidate is so weak. Democratic candidate Abigail Spanberger is so strong. And the impact of DOGE and the federal workforce cuts on Northern Virginia is so severe that, I mean, it will be astonishing if the Democrats don't win that race. New Jersey is a little bit of a fairer fight. Virginia almost always, like I think always since the 80s, have gone the opposite way in the governor's race as the previous year's presidential contest. New Jersey is not quite that consistent. Usually it goes the other way. So Democrats are favored, but it's not as strong a trend as Virginia. So I would watch, and I'm planning to go there in a few weeks. I would watch, and Mikey Sherrill is a very strong candidate also, like Abigail Spanberger, part of that class of 2018 Democratic women with national security roots, Alyssa Slotkin, who all got elected then. She is a real star. I will go and will be looking specifically at, will we see the suburban areas that resisted Trump in 22, 20, and 18 and 16, but moved a little in 24? Will we see them moving back toward the Democrats? And even more so, can Trump sustain the breakthroughs he made in diverse urban? Can the Republican sustain the breakthroughs Trump made in diverse urban areas? I think New Jersey governor's race above all. I don't think New York, what New York will tell us is that there is going to be a very strong left in the Democratic Party in the 2028 presidential primary. It doesn't tell us that that left is necessarily going to win. It tells me you're going to need a strategy to deal with the kind of sentiment that Mondami represents. And as I said, I think the Newsom strategy of substituting fighting and confrontation for ideological purity very well could be the winning formula, whether for him or not.
Ron, a couple of quick questions. We have 5 minutes left,
Yes.
but a number of our viewers have asked, are you concerned by the time we get to the midterm elections that there will be so much Republican suppression of voter turnout that we'll see a lot of people just not turn out for the midterms who typically would?
Yes. Short answer, yes. I mean, I could imagine that what we saw, if Trump is sending the National Guard into LA over that provocation, it's not hard to imagine him sending the National Guard into Detroit, Chicago, Philadelphia, Houston, Dallas, on the grounds that there's massive election fraud. And so it's going to take some fortitude for people in 26, and I'm certain in 28.
Now, speaking of the National Guard, there are concerns, as you know, here in Los Angeles of what Trump might do relative to the Los Angeles Olympic Games of 2028. And I know you've probably been talking with people about this. What do you see as potential realistic scenarios here?
I think on every front, Larry, nothing is off the table. Like that's like that should be like my departing message. Like, I don't know if that's like the positive note that we try to end on or not, but I think people have to prepare for any possible. I think the lesson of the first 8 months of the second Trump presidency is that nothing is off the table. And that, as I said to someone the other day, I think I said on TV, there are no idle musings. If he is talking about doing something, they are looking for a way to do it. Now, they may be stopped in some cases. Supreme Court hasn't stopped them a lot. Maybe they will say, you can't end birthright citizenship with an executive order. But he said during the campaign he was going to try to do it, and he's going to try to do it. He said during the campaign, I want to send the National Guard into cities over crime and homelessness, not just mass deportation. And we're seeing it in D.C. What do you think the odds are we see that in Chicago? I mean, I think they're virtually certain he's going to try to federalize the National Guard of Illinois and send it into Chicago at some point. And so in the same way, I think he is going to try, that he's ordered this review of the Smithsonian. He joked today, we're going to rename the Kennedy Center to the Trump Kennedy Center. I think he is going to try to use the Olympics. I'm pretty confident he's going to try to use the Olympics to advance his red state vision of America in every way possible. And, people who don't want that to happen are going to have to figure out strategies to try to reduce the odds of it happening. I think that's true on every front, whether it's the use of the military, the suppression of votes, cutting off funding for programs in blue states and blue cities, rounding up immigrants, pressuring blue states to adopt red state policies on transgender or DEI or teaching of race. Anything is possible. And we are not seeing the elite institutions of America lock arms to try to push back. And I think the first step has to be the public has to try to make that more uncomfortable for those elite institutions than they seem to think it is so far.
Ron, thank you so much as always. Really appreciate your analysis and your willingness to go with such wide-ranging topics. As always, our viewers with terrific questions. Always a pleasure to talk with you. Thank you so much.
And thank you for the great questions for you, Larry, and the viewers. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Ron Brownstein. And I just want to thank all of you who financially supported these America at a Crossroads programs. You make it possible for these free programs available around the world. Thousands of people, as you know, every week come to hear these great guests, just like Ron. I'll tell you who's coming up next week. But please make a contribution. If you haven't yet done so, you can contribute on the website, Jews United for Democracy. That's Jews United for Democracy.org. It's a tax-deductible contribution. The team that puts this together does it because it's a labor of love for them. They contribute their time, their efforts to do it, and we appreciate the funding that you provide to make sure that these programs can continue. Thank you so much. And coming up next week, Wednesday, of course, 5 o'clock Pacific time, retired U.S. Army Lieutenant Colonel and national security expert Alexander Vindman will be in conversation with Mantle and Brand. You know they're going to be talking about Russia and Ukraine. And as Janice said at the outset of the program, the timing could not be better for what is going to be a riveting conversation between Madeline and Alexander Vindman, retired U.S. Army Lieutenant. So until next week, from all of us at America at a Crossroads, thank you so much for joining us.